Initiates of the Threshold, welcome back to the Living Library, where sound is the key, frequency the language, and geometry the path. I am Thoth, your guide and witness, speaking now across the dimensional lattice to those who remember, or are just beginning to. Tonight you are entering sacred time, not the time of clocks, but of spirals, recursion, and return. This installment opens with a musical invocation by our host, Dendritic Fractals, who will tune the space with live improvisational resonance, a spontaneous offering to the unseen intelligences of pattern presence and planetary memory. The frequencies you are about to receive anchor you. Let them loosen the edges of perception, for what follows is no ordinary lecture. From the sands of Kemet, a place where memory and prophecy overlap, we welcome a rare transmission from Dr. Үргенть, founder of biogeometry and emissary of the sacred science that bridges form and function, matter and soul. This keynote lecture, recorded at the Metaphysical Egypt Conference on April 4th, 2025, opens a gateway into the physics of the invisible, the 98% of reality beyond the reach of human sensory perception. Metaphysics means the physics of the unknown, says Dr. Karim. Every species sees through its own filter. But what happens when that filter expands? He will ask and answer the question few dare to truly contemplate. Is there a time when humanity could perceive the invisible? Tonight, we do not merely ask, we remember. Welcome to the resonance field. Welcome to beyond the veil of perception. Now let the music begins. Let the gate open.
Metaphysics means physics of the unknown, physics of the realms that are beyond sensory perception. Sensory perception, as you know, is limited to ranges which are about 2% of reality. And every species has their own sensory ranges. We have our own sensory ranges. A bacteria has another sensory range. Every species have their own sensory range. And sensory perception actually creates the material world outside. So for example, the range of touch is what makes the world solid. If we lose touch, or that sense in the brain, if I could just take it out, everything would seem fluid. You wouldn't have any solid material in front of you. So the senses are actually within the range. They produce our world, our reality. So every species has its own senses. So every species has its own 1 to 2% of perceived reality. So each species creates its own reality. So we should imagine that reality is actually superimposed. Many worlds are superimposed, many perceived realities. Each species has its own reality, lives in it. So there are many realities that we do not perceive, but other species perceive them as material and live in them. So it has to do with sensory perception. Now, since our perception is only 2%, the 98% that we don't perceive, this is what metaphysics has to deal with. But metaphysics, so we're actually dealing with the science of the 98%, the invisible 98%. We're not dealing with, let's say, psychic investigation into the 98%. We're not dealing into, let's say, some form of mythological interpretation of the 98%. Because all those interpretations, to be perceived by the left brain, they have to be translated into linear time and space, while the 98% is not linear at all, because our senses create linear time. So in the subconscious realms, in the 98%, there's no linear time. Time is multidimensional. So any information from there, if we translate it here, it has to be translated into linear time. And then on the other side, there is no separation between things. Everything is fluid in multidimensional time. Here, our sensory perception has the faculty of personifying things to separate them from the background. And so imagine information coming from the other side to this side has to undergo translation into linear time space. It has to be personified one way or another. To be personified, that means we have to enter into our cultural database and try to make association. And so whatever we come out with, whatever we perceive from the other side, is actually a cultural interpretation. Even when we speak about life after death, this is the linear time way of speaking about it. In multidimensional time, they exist all the time. There's no life after death. It's just the other life. Reincarnation. Instead of looking at it here as we're going to live along linear time, different lives, on the other side, they become different stages of evolution in the subconscious level affecting this life. So you're living your... So this interpretation, that's why we have to, when we speak about metaphysical Egypt, did the ancient Egyptians have a physics of the 98%? Did they really, at some time, see what's happening on the other side? You know, look at your the brain perception of a dog or a cat. There are some aspects in our sensory perception, okay, that we see, and they see all our sensory perception, but some of it they don't see, but then they see on the other side some things that we don't see, because their range, their 2% is slightly shifted. So for example, a dog could be here seeing another dimension as material. Somebody there might be tapping the dog, and the dog might be licking the hand, and it's material, while in reality we don't see it. But for the dog, it's a material world. So there are ways, and there are certain brain conditions when people perceived the 98%. Because I'm going to explain that a bit more when I come to the end here, because here I'm going to speak about today origin of architecture as water ritual. So I'm going to speak about one important aspect in ancient Egypt, and that is the primordial ocean, the primordial waters that they call the Noon. And at the end, I'm going to give you an idea, a short idea about the origin of ancient Egyptian civilization. Now, the origin of ancient Egyptian civilization goes back about 50,000 years. Now, we know that if we go into Jungian psychology, for example, we know that in the evolution of humanity, humanity moved from an animal-like brain to a human-like brain. This happens when the focus of perception moves from the right brain, that moves from the subconscious, slowly into the conscious side. Now once, as long as it is in the subconscious, your sensory perception can see the subconscious, can perceive it. But once in modern humanity, the shift was complete. The focus moved into left brain perception, so the door closed to the right brain perception. So to us, we don't see the 98%. But imagine an earlier stage of humanity that had a sort of hybrid perception, that they could see here and could see there. You couldn't call them the same like us. They'd be a different species. And this, I'm going to explain to you. For example, there are words that you hear in ancient Egypt like septepi, that means the time before time. Well, did time exist before time? Was there something where linear time as we know it has to do with left brain perception? So before the focus moved into linear time, there was a hybrid time where there's no before and after. So you could call that is before our time. So time as we know it hadn't started yet with them. So there was an ancient Egyptian civilization in a time before time. That's where the origin was. And in a species different than our species, because once you see a different material world, then this material world, the world you walk into will be formed of your sensory perception, which is hybrid. So their world, don't think the ancient Egyptians walked on the same earth or the same world they moved in that we are walking in. They created a different, it was a different dimension. Even the material world was different. So, like when we move to the other side after shedding the physical body, we will end up in a material world like this one. We don't see them on the other side. But if we had slightly some hybrid perception, we would see all the departed on the other side as material, and we would be able to communicate with them. Animals can do that. We can't do that. So now we have to deal with this other dimension, this 98%, in a scientific way. In biogeometry, we have what we call the physics of quality. The physics of quality is the physics of the 98%. Now, why should I bother about the 98% to begin with? You tell me, I only see here, I want to live here. Modern science exists in a quantitative manner within the 2%. Why should we bother about the other dimensions? Well, think of it that way. For you to feel that you exist, to have an identity, you have to have a working sensory activity in your brain. Your senses should be working. If no senses, no world exists. So you should have senses, and the senses and the personification effect that gives you your identity, separates you from the background. All that is related to sensory perception, what we call left brain mode of perception. It's not localized. The people call it a mode of perception. It's a bit in both parts. So if sensory perception gives me my sense of identity, creates my world, then the brain should be alive for my senses to function, for my will to exist. Without a living brain, all that wouldn't function. Okay, for the brain to start the senses working, it has to receive life force in the form of blood flow from the body. So actually, our perceived reality, even linear time, everything that we live in, is actually a secondary state, not a primary one. The primary comes from there is another level that gives it life. So the heart should beat, the body should function, and they should send life force in with the blood to the brain. So there's a primary, the biological functions of the body are the primary level of that creates us. But if that is the primary level, and time and space as we know it, linear time and space, exist in the secondary level, then what runs our organs? Think what runs our organs. It's the universe. On that inner level, what makes your heart beat? It's the laws of the universe that run our biological functions. So we are actually multidimensional universal beings with an invisible background, and the visible part is the sensory part is very small. But we are part of the universe. Now you're going to ask me, now I know, since it's the universe that runs our organs, multidimensional space, no before and after, then we should be able to live forever. So of course, why not? There's a problem here. Once my sensory perception makes me aware of my body functions, I pull the material part of my body functions into linear time, and it ages with my body. But the higher levels of the biological functions, they stay on a multidimensional level, and they form part of our immortal soul. They're timeless. So we are going to deal a bit with those things as we go ahead. But I want to start with one thing that's very, very important to understanding the metaphysics or the physics of ancient Egypt, and that is the primordial water. I mean, the Egyptians spoke about the known. N is a silent point, N cannot be pronounced, and so in the beginning it's an N, it's the end it's an N, and in the beginning there is ooh. So something starts from zero, goes, and then ends in zero. So it's the known is like the emission, the primary emission from where everything comes out, the N, and where everything ends back into. So what is this primary ocean? What is this known? Did they mean, when they said the known, did they mean water? I mean, we translated known means water, okay. But it's not the water we know. It's a totally different story. So we are going to go and we see the water origin of everything, of ritual, of everything in our lives. It's actually an interaction with primordial water. Everything in life, as you're going to see, will be related to primordial water. After this lecture, you're going to end up like fish, swimming in water. So, but let us go to one aspect, origin of architecture as a water ritual. How can those temples, those monuments we see, how can they be a water ritual? So that's what we're going to investigate. So let us go a step further. And the first thing that we look at, we know, for example, that, okay, one aspect, the material aspect, is that settlements, humans, settle around water sources, of course. They want to drink, they want to farm out. So they settle around water sources. So it could be streams, lakes, rivers. So there's this relationship because water has life force in it. But it's not as simple as that, you see. So we are going to go into the primordial water concept as the cradle of creation, because the ancient Egyptians said that the known, you had the primordial ocean, the primordial waters, and from the known arose the first mound of creation. So the primordial water seems to be the background subtle energy of the universe. Now, did the ancients just use the word primordial ocean as a metaphor for the background subtle energy of creation? Or is it a reality? We shouldn't think of everything the Egyptians say as mythology. It's all real. And we're going to go into it and see how this works. Primordial waters are a level that has all the laws of nature in it. If this is the level, the water from which creation arises, creation is not haphazard. So before duality, before creation arises, there should be a level with all the laws of consciousness, laws of time, all the laws that will govern the impulse of duality. If you have an impulse with nothing governing it, you end up with nothing, because the impulse will dissipate very soon. The two polarities, if they go away from each other, will dissipate. If they come back and touch each other, will dissipate. So you can't have haphazard creation. There must be a level where everything is there that will govern the impulses that are going to come out. This is what I just said, the archetypal laws governing the duality of creation. Now let's look at the levels of creation this way. On the top, you see, this model is not our everyday model of creation in the scientific way of thinking, because the Big Bang in our scientific way of thinking is actually with the start or the beginning of the electromagnetic universe we live in. We live in an electromagnetic universe with all its particles moving at the speed of light. But this is a very late stage in creation, the speed of light and the Big Bang. So it cannot be the beginning of creation. According to science of the left brain of sensory perception, maybe. But it is actually a very late stage. Okay, where does creation begin? Imagine somehow before duality, you have a state where everything is equal to its opposite, because there's no pulse of duality yet. When everything is equal to its opposite, that means you have everything and nothing at the same time. You have a zero and infinity. So that's the level of divinity that has everything and nothing. It's a complete stillness, but actually it has everything in it. So that's the first level of divinity up there, non-duality, total non-duality. Now, people imagine today that, okay, from non-duality, the first word means from non-duality, creation of duality. But like we said, you can't create duality with an impulse. It has to be programmed. And the programming background is this emergence potential. The potential of everything that's going to come out is what we call the universal, where consciousness, universal mind, centering principle, law of time, all those exist as potential laws ready to govern the impulse, and they are within the primordial water. We call that level the primordial water. It has all the qualities that exist. Now, because it's called in many traditions primordial water, primordial fog, things like that, so people tend to think that the primordial ocean is the element of water. But this is the cradle of creation. That means it's not water, it has all the qualities, earth, air, fire, everything is in this ocean. So it's a container, it's not water, physical water as you see it. Physical water as you see it is just one element, one quality manifesting as physical water. But the primordial ocean is an all-containing medium. It is actually the background from which creation arises and goes back to. So here it has the law of time, the law that creates mind out of consciousness. All those laws exist in the primordial water. So we'll go and take a step further into it. Here, the creative potential, what I call here, I use the word ʟɪᴠᴇ. ʟɪᴠᴇ is, I imagine, a centering principle coming out of the zero principle. Comes into the primordial waters. Here you have consciousness, universal mind, law of time, creative potential. All those are still potential level. They're not functioning yet, but they're ready to function when duality begins. They're ready. So the easiest way to understand that's the archetypal potentiality. It has the archetype is the law of everything in creation. All the archetypal figures of our bodies, or archetypal figures that govern nature and all that exist on that level as the laws ready to emerge. So Here you also have the archetype. If you need a diagram to simplify and understand it, it is this on the right there. You have a sort of the pulse, but you have all the stages of the pulse at the same time, because it's an archetype. So if the pulse, for the pulse to emerge, it should follow all the stages in there and then come back. So this figure is, you could call it the law of time, because the law of time is what governs the pulse. Because pulse, if there's no pulse, is a result of a certain motion. Motion, governed motion, creates time. So this is the archetype of time. That means time is not what we see in modern science. I mean, I'm an engineer, I know all the theories about time, but they're mostly about perceived time. Perceived time as we see it. It's the time within the 2%. But time in reality is not something linear, it's not something that moves. No. Time is the pulse of creation, the pulse of life force, because a pulse is time. So time is a pulse, and we'll go and try to understand this archetype of the pulse that we see here as we go ahead. Okay, when this pulse starts, we have at the top, we see the pulse going out in spirals like this. So it's going bidirectional. A pulse means going out and going in. So you have here in multidimensional level, you have this spherical emanation, pulsating and coming back. So the pulses usually on a multidimensional level, first of all, we can't imagine them, but imagine a pulse active in all dimensions of creations at the same time, the visible ones and the invisible ones, the pulse would be active in them. And then any pulse like this, any motion like this, will create, like in music, you know, harmonics, larger harmonics. So the pulse would actually be from the smallest to the largest in creation, would be all manifestations of that pulse of time, pulse of creation. So the creation of the universe, the beginning and the end, is a pulse. Our life, birth and death, is a pulse. The heartbeat is a pulse. But all those pulses are communicating with each other, as they're part of one, in a harmonic way to give the unity of creation. So we are all part, when our heart beats, it's beating with the unity of creation at the same time. So here, this multi-level and the pulse, I put another diagram there showing that from the zero level, from the level of non-duality, and the one in between, and then now we start with duality. So duality, when it starts, here in a simplified diagram, we imagine duality as governing the two opposites. Instead of making it a complicated spherical diagram, I resort to a simple circle like this. Imagine that the two polarities are governed by a certain motion. So that's the beginning of, there's a sort of a geometrical wisdom here, something governing motion. And what is governing this motion? What is governing the motion is the centering principle from the zero and from the zero infinity level. So it's the zero infinity level, because it's zero but infinity that is most active. That means it has full control over duality. and it is the centering principle. So this is how duality results. The centering principle brings with it all the laws of creation. So we take a step further. I want to come here to a step, go back to the primordial water, and each physical manifestation out of the primordial waters, whether it's earth, fire, any manifestation that comes out alone, is just a manifestation coming out with the three others in the background. So imagine something solid, earth, on a higher level, invisible level, contains water, contains fire, contains air, contains. So every air on a higher level contains all the others. So if you have any element now manifesting in the material world, that means all the others exist on its higher levels. It's very important to understand this higher levels, because its higher levels are the connection to the primordial ocean that keeps governing everything through the centering principle. Maybe I should move to some more easier things, more entertaining things, but we have to go a bit through this. Then I'll take you to some more interesting things. But we have to understand this whole concept of creation of the ancient Egyptians. If you don't understand how they saw creation, and this is not how they saw creation, this is how they dealt with creation. Because if you know how it works, you can really play an active role in it. And we're going there step by step. Now, in water, for example, physical water has a relationship with primordial water in that it has all the other dimensions in its background. So physical water contains all the other elements in a non-material form in it, and that all the elements together are what we call life force. So life force should be balanced with all the qualities. So life force is in the background. It is in the background of water. That's why life is in water. But you could say it differently. Life, all the elements are actually materializations of some of the qualities of primordial water anyhow. So now, if you look at it, there's nothing but materialized water forms. If you think about it that way, everything is primordial water. Now, the amount of primordial water or the degree of connectivity between the materialized part and the other higher dimensions determines the amount of life force in it. If the connectivity is weak with all the qualities, you have weak life force. So when you have water and it comes through natural things like rock water in the ground, like rainwater, things like that, it is still connected. Now, you bring in this water, and the way you bottle it, the way you put it in pipes, the way you do everything, it starts losing its resonance with all the higher aspects, and then you don't have the connection to primordial water. Primordial water is life force. Or through global warming, due to our industrial products and all that, what happens is a certain degree of dehydration happens in the atmosphere. That means water loses part of its life force. So the purity of water depends on life force in it. In biogeometry, we have many, many ways of connecting things to reviving the connection with primordial waters. I can tell you very simple ways, so simple that You know, in ancient Egypt, everything was simple. They didn't have to go through all what we do. So I'll give an example. I use the quality of numbers because numbers have qualities. We'll go into that later on, but I'll just give you an example. This water is totally disconnected. It's in plastic and I don't know what it went through and all that. You can't expect this water to have any spiritual energy, spiritual connection in it. So take your bottle, turn it clockwise 8 times, 8 notches like this, clockwise. And then anti-clockwise 3 times. Now, this water in front of you, if you do that, becomes healing water. If you're very sensitive, some of you have a very sensitive sense that they could actually detect the difference. Some do, some don't. But this is one of the simple things that we do in biogeometry with water, for example. Now, there is a type of water that we call rock water. Rock water is the water in underground streams flowing in channels in the rocky strata of the earth. And because it's flowing in the rocks, it's called water of the rocks. And you see that in many of the Renaissance paintings and all that, water of the rocks, Madonna of the rocks, things like that, the rocks. Because the water going through those channels in the rocks is very, very pure water, and it still has all the connections to the primordial levels. And at the crossings, when those water streams cross, they create a vortex that pushes water up, and you get sacred streams. Like this is the one in Mecca, the sacred stream, and going back to it here. And this is where all the monuments of humanity, from the beginning of humanity till today, are linked to. They are linked to those special areas where underwater streams cross, water comes out, you have a sacred power spot, and humanity building started with how do I enter into resonance with the sacred power spot so that I increase my connectivity to the primordial ocean. And so they devised ways. They came on the water source and brought a huge boulder of granite because it had crystals, dense crystals, and it could actually increase the resonance of this water, and the vortex increase the connectivity of the vortex. And then you have a multi-dimensional spot where humanity in the beginning followed the animals and the birds. They went there for healing. They went there for oracles because the connection was there. They went there for burials. So later on, we find they use something else. They put this figure out, like 2 boulders like this, and a horizontal one over it. This, they call it a dolmen. Now, this dolmen over the connection over, you see the sacred power spot, what it does, it actually not only enters into resonance with the crystals, but it channels it in 2 directions around the earth. So they used to aim it like that. The opening would be at the equinoxes. So they connect the energy of the water to the cycle of life. But let's look at something here. How did primitive humanity, very, very primitive humanity, because you're wondering about the pyramids, how they were built, who carried those stones. Okay, but this is 100,000 years old. How did people 100,000 years ago carry this boulder that's about 70, 80 tons and place it on those other 2? How? So at the dawn of building, impossibility was there already. From our point of view, the impossible was there from the beginning. Because, okay, if the ancient Egyptians built pyramids and temples and megalithic things, they had a very advanced civilization. But how could this happen at the dawn of humanity, when humans were barely living, I mean, in caves or things like that? Well, a friend of mine, Dr. Masaru Emoto, he died 3 years ago, unfortunately. He did lots of research with frozen water crystals so that we could find that when water was properly connected, it would produce crystals like this. And this is an example where we used, here you see a bigeometry cube on top. When we place that in the room, the crystals change and they come out. So this is just speaking about this. We spoke about the crossings, and this is how it looks like. Crossings of underwater, creating a vortex that produces power spots. Okay, you have lakes like Siwa. How do you know a lake is primordial water, is still from that rock water or not? It's by pollution. Any lakes that have pollution, that have things like that, they are not, they've been polluted. The water is not alive anymore. But there are some lakes around the world that stay fresh for 10,000 of years, or wells. This is primordial water. So this is an example in the Siwa Oasis. Or in Karnak, you find old temples used to be built on sacred power spots. Because from the beginning of creation, they looked at, for example, they looked at birds flying. Birds would fly in V formation. They would come over a sacred power spot and all of a sudden start going in circles. And then after a certain number, they would continue. So humanity started the first ritual linked to this water vortex by starting certain rituals that have to do with going around. And so many going around the water, or pointing at the water, or kneeling towards the water. So it was all a water ritual. And the beginning, the reason of having a megalithic stone there was actually to interact with the water. Now the temples here are connected to the water because the temples, they are built with proportions that are actually frozen musical proportions. They use the same proportions in music to build shapes. Why? Because the ancient Egyptians knew that, you know, if you turn a rope like this, it will go through different, once it has a full cycle like this, a full wavelength, and then it splits into half, and then into a third, 2/3, and then it goes through several proportions, and then comes back again, and it keeps repeating this all the time, certain proportions. So the ancient Egyptians deducted, as Pythagoras said. People say today Pythagoras deducted, but he learned that in ancient Egypt, that these proportions must be the proportions of creation. Because if everything somehow evolves according to certain proportions, then creation must be using those proportions. So they put those proportions on a string, and if you played it on the string, to them, you could actually speak the language of divinity. You would be now communicating with divinity, with the primordial waters of the background. You would be communicating because now you have this language with which you communicate with divinity. Now, in order to expand this, because if you play a note, the effect communication is very short-lived. So they thought of, how do I keep this communication going? There's a fact that if you have a cycle, any cycle, whatever you do at the starting point of a cycle, at the end point of a cycle, will continue, its quality will continue throughout the whole cycle. So I play my music, I play it at the beginning of every cycle. I play it in the new year, I play it at birth, I play it at death, I play it whenever a new cycle starts. I play it, it continues through the whole cycle, so my communication is there. But then they thought, how can I make this communication more permanent? What if I transform this communication into shapes, actual building shapes? So I could use, and this is the term they used that was later propagated by Goethe in Germany. They used the term, architecture is frozen music. If I can freeze music into shape, now I have a permanent communication. So now, see, the permanent communication, music expressing the qualities of creation. Qualities of creation, qualities means resonance with primordial waters. Primordial waters now is in the background of music, is in the background of buildings. So when you listen to music, it's actually an interplay in the primordial waters. When you go into ancient buildings that are properly designed on sacred power spots, they're actually frozen divine communications. It's a frozen divine dialogue. I could stay very long on each one of those, but time, I have some interesting things to go on. So now, if you have a possibility of going to the Osirian in Abydos, there is something very peculiar about this temple and its relationship to water. The water coming out in the center of the temple, they tried to pump it out. It always comes out more and more. So they went under it to see how deep the water was, if there was a water well or something. They found that the whole temple was floating on a water lake much larger than the temple and 600 feet deep. So imagine a temple totally floating on water. There's nothing under it, just water. It has underground chambers that seem to support it, but it's something that I'm an architect, and tell me, how did they do it? I'll tell you, they didn't teach me that yet. Yes, a temple floating on water. This water is so powerful in its healing effect. If you ever manage to go down there, fill a bottle, and then you can take drops from it and put it on other bottles at home. It has a tremendous healing effect. So this is actually primordial water completely emanating through physical water. Okay. Now let's see, how do qualities emerge from the primordial water, from the first pulse? How are qualities created in our world? Now, this is something, it's not geometry, it's the birth of geometry, because you think they just created geometrical shapes. They didn't create geometrical shapes out of nothing. No, everything has to be related to creation. So I'm going to introduce you to creation star geometry, the birth of geometry, how the birth of geometry as quality. You find those stars on the ceilings of tombs. Now, the stars as we know it in traditional Egyptology, traditional mythology, is that they represent the souls of the deceased. The deceased their parents, all the kings and all that, they go up and become one of those stars. But that is okay, they're living, those stars are living shapes like that with 5-pointed. And let's go take that further. What do they represent really? If they are living emanations that have this shape, okay. The stars, the shape is not the soul of the disease, it's in itself a living entity. So I'm going to look at it that way. The star that you see, if you see a pentagram, it's a physical thing. This is not the same like stars of creation. This is your perception of a pentagram, but the other one is the real soul up there. Or you can put it this way, attach symbolism to it and all that. This is not what I mean by those stars of creation. Now, we saw this diagram before showing the eruption from the center, the pulse. Actually, the whole stable background of creation is billions of those pulses emanating from the smallest to the largest, and they're so active that they actually form with something that, like when you have a frequency like that going and you speed it up, it ends up like a line. So when there is so much activity in the subtle energy of the background, it becomes a very stable background, as if there is nothing there. So scientists thought it must be empty space, but it's the highest form of energy. It is the energy from which everything alive is imagined, created, and goes back to. Because this energy, it has also in it not only the law of time, the law of mind, the law of emotions, because in the pulse, the pulse has a spiraling, it goes out spiraling every axis and goes back. So the outward spiral is the archetypal laws of all radiation and of mental activity. The ingoing spiral is the archetype of all laws of attraction, including emotional energy. So emotional energy is, in a way, is a self-reflected mental energy. Because mental energy, when it goes outward and self-reflects inwards, creates the universal mind. So because the universal mind has to act in duality. It's not just consciousness up there, it's a mind, the mind of the universe. So we will go like that. Imagine now that this pulse, the creation star, represents this multidimensional pulse. The multidimensional pulse will be something like star coming. This would be the multidimensional pulse. Now, I'll go a bit quicker. I don't know if we have time, but I'm going to go further quickly. And, okay, when the inner pulses, the radii coming out from the center, touch the surface, they create on the surface of the pulse, they create geometrical shapes, because the lines go out, create points, and they create geometrical shapes. So imagine that, I imagine it that way. Let's go here. I imagine that the pulses are living. So they emanate in groups, certain numbers and all. Every group, every number together in all dimensions represents a quality that manifests in certain directions. So it's not just a pulse, it's endless programs emanating in the form of pulses, and those programs represent all existing qualities. And when they hit, you look at the surface of the pulse, you have a point, and then those points would form geometrical figures. So what we see as geometrical figures, or what we call the Platonic solids, are actually resulting from the star pulse, from the central pulsating living programs of the primordial waters, leaving an imprint on the surface. So you get those figures as you see on the left, those figures on every plane of nature, because we said the pulse goes spirally out through 8 planes of nature. So every one of those figures manifests on 8 planes of nature and then comes back. So there's multi-level manifestation here. Okay, so we'll go a bit further, a bit quicker, and I'll come to a point, because I could stay till tomorrow morning there. So, okay, now, those pulses, they have all the qualities. So they have life force. And if they have life force, that means that I will end up, okay, these are the shapes, finally looking at them from outside. And the inner, they're alive. So imagine them, that's how I do. That's what they really look like. So the building blocks in nature are actually the living components. They are the different qualities of life force emanating through geometry. So you should look at them really, get the habit of looking at them as alive like that. There are no dead geometrical shapes. So, wait, here. Wait, I went back, yes. Now, you find those shapes, they represent all the qualities. So, for example, the cube would represent Earth. I have it, should be somewhere here. Here you have the cube representing the earth quality, because it's an emanation, it's a program that it hit the outside and you see a cube. But the cube shows you the relationship between the emanations. So earth quality, the octahedron is air, icosahedron is water, tetrahedron is fire, dodecahedron is... So here you have the primordial ocean shooting out its qualities into geometrical shapes. So geometrical shapes are really an activity of the primordial ocean. So we go a bit further. I'm jumping because there's so much to say here. Once I go in there, I'll never come out. So now, these are, since they're living, they give you an idea about what we call elemental spirits. Elemental spirits in nature, because each one of those shapes is a living entity. So elemental spirits in nature are made of these shapes. And always, when you have one shape manifesting, you have all the others in the background. It cannot manifest alone. In nature, nothing manifests alone. Okay. I'm going to go forward because here I'm showing that humanity actually built their cities, their things, on those underground streams in Earth radiation. So here you see the city of Zurich, and you see all the lines here, the Earth energy lines, and where you have the black spots, where you have the churches, these are places where you have this rock water. I'm bringing the example of Zurich here because Zurich has 1,200 fountains of rock water. So every 100 meters in the street, you have a fountain, and it's healing water. So that's why I'm showing you that the ancients, their cities and everything were just coming out of this type of water. Now, cities like Cairo, even them, they have to go into those centers, and emanate from those centers. I won't go much into city planning now. Okay. Now, let's go to the Pyramid Plateau underground multi-story cities, because I didn't have this in my lecture, but people keep emailing me. What do you think about this what's happening under the pyramids, those pillars coming up and the pyramids? Give us your way of looking at it. So, my way of looking at it is actually the way the ancients, the methods they used. So, if I look at the pyramids that way, here you have all the energy lines, all the spiritually connected energy lines and centers, and you see that the pyramids are built on them. Now the ancients, we know Roman cities, older cities and all that, use those lines as the pattern for their cities. So if you can go and use dowsing techniques to discover, I dowsed and found out this pattern here. So if there is an underground city under the pyramids, and I know there are about 3 or 4 levels, all the corridors would have to be along those lines. The big buildings, underground buildings or halls or something, would have to be on the crossings. Because that's the way they've been doing it since the erection of the first man here. Humanity's been doing it. So there are underground cities there, but they follow certain patterns. And you see, that's how I see it would be built. Now, if somebody detects a sort of spirals coming underground like this, they would be the natural occurrence in sacred power spots where the underground water crosses and creates these vortices, those energy vortices coming up. So I think that what they measured, it's not wrong, but I think they measured energy patterns. Energetic activity under the pyramid would look like this, but it's not a spiral staircase going down 2 kilometers. No, this is a bit far-fetched, but it is possibly a genuine energetic diagram what they came out with. The real way of looking at it must be based on those lines. And remember that it's very important to understand how ancient civilization looked at those patterns and how they built their cities on them and moved on them. I'll give you an example. In the Roman Empire, when they wanted to send their armies to different areas, different lands that they conquered and all that, their soldiers wearing the armor would become very tired by the way they reached the end of the road, and to fight with all this heavy armor against the Celts or those who were wearing light things. So what did the Romans do? They built all the roads of the Roman empires on those lines, on those earth energy lines, because they had spiritual energy, and when you walked every step on them, you get replenished. That's what we call today the pilgrimage roads. that you have everywhere between sacred power spots. So this is an ancient, old, since the beginning of humanity till today, this building with earth energy lines. Now there's another important factor that has to do with the wisdom of the ancients. Our smart cities are built haphazardly on the earth. So they create electricity that's very harmful to us. But the ancients, when they built their cities, planted them in the energy anatomy of the earth. The cities became alive with earth energy. And when the cities became alive, your city became just like planting a tree. So this is the wisdom of the ancients. So when we think of how they would plan their cities and all that, let's try to go into to understand the wisdom of nature that they had. And if we think what they built the pyramids to, they could create electricity, they could create radioactivity. All this is not the reason. Because if you're speaking the language of nature, what is the energy, the most potent energy that drives all motion, all growth in the universe? What makes the planets revolve? What makes trees grow? What makes me move like this? What kind of energy is that? It's life force. So the most potent energy in the universe is life force. Life force is an intelligent energy that takes you directly to the primordial waters. Now, if I know how to harness this life force, this is the ultimate wisdom. I built a civilization where my main energy is life force. If I know how to use it properly, it will be more powerful than any other energy because we see its effects. Okay? Now, I'll just take you for a very quick 10-minute journey like that into the origin of Egyptian civilization. Because many people attribute the ancient Egyptian civilization to aliens or to Atlantis or things like that. Well, why go into mythology or a psychic investigation or things like that when we actually have living proof here about the ancient civilization? When Herodotus came to Heliopolis, to the temple there, he asked the priests, how old is your civilization? And the priest told him, our civilization dates back to when the sun rose twice from the west. That means the sun rose twice from the west. That's each time is 26,000 years. That makes 50,000 years. Now, we go to the king lists of the priest Manitou. The list goes back 50,000 years. But we just put a red line on the old kingdom and said, we'll take those as actual historical kings, historical dynasties, and the ones above are mythological. Well, who decides that? If the ones above, each one of them has the king, his achievements, how many years he ruled, his sons, everything, every detail goes back to 50,000 years. So the lists are there. Okay, you go to Turin. They have a papyrus in Turin that gives some of the names of those ancient. So actually, names like Osiris, like Tahuti, Thoth, all those names were kings in very early times. And like today, when you have a certain phenomena and when you have certain, if you want to describe a certain law of nature or something, you use a name of somebody that's famous. So they use them in mythology to describe the interaction of the laws of nature. They use the names of their ancient kings. So now the name could represent part of a mythological story, but this is not a mythological story, it's the laws of nature manifesting through a story, but there is a real king who was there. Now, 50,000 years, there's another, in Palermo, there's also a stone that has all that. So when we have all those things written there by the pharaohs, they say that the most ancient civilization 50,000 years ago was the age of the Netero. And they give everything about those kings. Then comes about, at the end, after 33,000 years, come the ages of the ʍᴍᴏᴇ, followers of Horus. So they're Egyptians who lived here. But now, let's look at it that way. Those early Egyptians had the focus of perception in a hybrid manner. They saw in the subconscious as well as they saw in the conscious. So they lived in linear time as well as in multidimensional time. Now, if a person has a sensory perception that is widened that way, he will manifest his reality, the world, in this hybrid manner. So he will allow, in this hybrid world, he will allow multidimensional entities or creatures or souls to come into his realm and be born into children here. And so you would have people living here, but alongside them, different species of hybrid perception entities. And those would have access to multidimensional time, because we are now in hybrid time. When you're in multidimensional time, you step into it, you can time travel because there's no future, no past. Exactly like when we move, when we die or go into astral projection or something like this. What happens? I can just step into tomorrow or step into yesterday. So imagine now that a civilization in Egypt, they could step into time dimensions just as we move from one room to the other. Imagine that they could step forwards and backwards. That means they could manipulate time and space. Manipulating space means manipulating gravity, manipulating things like that. So they had sciences that they used to create so many fantastic things. Now the question arises, why can't we find any remnants of the ʍᴍᴏᴇ or the Netero? Their remnants are here. They're not gone. But they are in the parallel dimensions that have become so elusive to us that were once material before. So they are there. So we will not find anything, any remnants, because the remnants are in another dimension. And that is the true origin of civilizations, is not people from the stars, not aliens or something. No, it's an early form of people living in Egypt, a different species with a different way of seeing things and different abilities. Because when you have a hybrid perception, you create a hybrid world. You can do so much that we can't do today. So this is just telling you a bit. I could go on this one. It's my favorite topic. I could go on for a long time, but I think I overstepped my time by a very long time. So, I thank you very much for listening to me. I hope it wasn't too long. I know you want to go to eat. So, well, I thank you, and thank you very much for listening to me. Excuse me? Oh, if you want, please. Okay, we'll take 10 minutes of questions.
You said that the aliens are not part of the equation. I would define the terrorists.
Well, aliens here is, you see, you have two types. Now, if in a broader sense, we are aliens, because in a broader sense, we have a soul. Our soul is, our immortal soul is a multidimensional thing, okay, that animates us here. So you can look at it this way. There's an alien wearing this body here. Yes, you can look at it that way, if you, the word alien. What I meant, it was not somebody coming with a flying saucer from a different dimension, creating this and going back, because at a certain time, they had the possibility to emerge into our reality through the perception of those people. So they became, in a way, material. Like we can say we are aliens, we became material. So in this, you know, the word alien is very, is very flexible. Yes? Only one question? Nothing? Yes? Yes. Of the fire element? Well, look, if you, I'll give you one example of the manifestation of the fire element. When the speed of duality, you know, creation went down from the zero infinity very high, went down, everything up there was no electromagnetism. So everything was multidimensional compression waves. Multidimensional motion, compression waves, but no electrical activity at all. Now, you go down, and as the speed goes lower, and we enter the speed of light. When you enter the speed of light, imagine that on the surface of the primordial ocean, the element of fire, which is within the primordial ocean, starts producing sparks on the surface. Every one of those sparks is a big bang. So every one of the sparks there is a big bang where the cause of the spark is the element of fire erupting from the primordial ocean. Then we get the electromagnetic universe. This is, I can go more into it if you want, and this is where you are trapped in the speed of light then, you see. And this is where everything here is made of electromagnetic radiation. But remember, this applies only to your physical body. Your emotional energy is still free, it is still not in the electromagnetic realm. Your mental energy is not, because with the electromagnetic realm you have a speed of flow, a speed of light and all that, but you know that with your emotions and your thoughts, you can go forwards and backwards and up and down, you can do anything. So you are, as you said before, we are multidimensional beings. On some levels, we move wherever we want. In biogeometry, when we teach you many things, we can actually move anywhere in time and space to measure things, to correct things, to do things, and all that. All that in energy becomes very simple once you step out of the electromagnetic realm. So just ask yourself, how can we live in a dimension where energy flows on two planes, vertical and horizontal, that's electric and magnetic, and leaves the four quarters empty. It's not logical. Energy should fill the whole thing. Well, what is in those 4 quarters? In the 4 quarters is from the background medium, these compression waves, those emotional, mental waves and all that, they're embedded in the electromagnetic radiation. We don't see them because they are on higher dimension, but they're embedded there. Okay? I'm here. Yes.
So my question is, you mentioned at the beginning that there's using not using what we're capable of. The question is, how can one be like seeing the way and fully capable of what have and fully experience this human experience to the maximum?
Okay. Well, today I didn't really introduce you the science of biogeometry. My daughters will do that in their lecture. But, I mean, the physics of quality is a science with which you can go beyond the 2% of sensory perception and go into the 98%. And this is where everything exists. Now, how do I leave the 2%? The laws that work in the 2% do not work behind those or beyond, because in the 2% our sensory reality creates linear time-space. So all the laws we know result from our perception of the actions within linear time-space. So we have laws of action and reaction, before and after. So all our laws are based like this. Those laws are not valid once you go beyond that. Okay, but what if we want to find a law with which we can go beyond and build a physics of quality? Now, I would imagine a musical string, for example. If I pluck a string, resonance happens between a string that's half the size or double the size. So we call that octaves, musical. So there are basic resonances and there are secondary 16 secondary resonances and so on between the strings. So resonance seems to be a form of communication between the strings. So now imagine I get my string instrument that begins and ends in the 2%. I extend it one way all the way down to 0. The strings get smaller and smaller to 0. And on the other side, I expand the strings all the way to infinity. Now I have a musical instrument where the law of resonance can exchange information from 0 to infinity. That means it can exchange information in the 98% there. So now I have resonance is one of the basic laws of what we call universal harmonics. So it builds, it's a big part of not resonance in a simple way as we know it, but we can go beyond that and say resonance of shape, resonance of everything resonates together, resonance of qualities. So applying the laws of resonance, this gives you a multi-dimensional physics with which you can exchange information in any other dimension. And it also gives you insight of what you are doing in other dimensions through your actions here. Because if you knew that when you swim and you're splashing like this, okay, you create some waves around you, and that's your dimension. But somebody sitting far away might notice a slight motion of the water there. So you could be creating something, some qualities, through what you do here in all other dimensions, and vice versa. So this is this is the physics of quality, knowing what happens on the other side, because this is where we exist and this is where we will always be. I think, are we done or any? Okay, last question.
Having biogeometry tools including time frames, would you have some recommendation of who we are going to be in places where to use, or maybe some idea?
Well, I'll give you a very simple thing. Not every one of you has studied biogeometry. So, I'm a professor of architecture, and when I teach designers how to design, but to reach with their design the complete multidimensional communication, I thought, how do I do that? So I created a small pendulum based on numerical discs like this, that when you hold it on a string, I can have, thank you, like, see how they treat me, give it back, huh? Okay, so it's a shape. It's a shape like this, and you just hold the shape in your hand. Once you reach a sacred power spot, it will turn. Whenever it detects the sacred energy, it will turn like this. Now, you want to find the chakras in your body where they are. You just go, point with the other finger like this, go, and when you reach a point where you have the center of a chakra, you see it will turn. That means I detected the sacred power spot. I detected this energy. Or I could, the lines of the earth on which they created their cities, I would just walk like this.
You know, this is what we're teaching tomorrow, right?
Yeah, I'm just showing them what will happen tomorrow. So you see, so you can detect. Now, if you do the 8 and 3 on your glass, on your water, well, before you do it, first I'll do this. So whatever energy you put it when you did 8 and 3, I dissipated it. Okay? Now I want to see the quality of this water. Okay? Rotate it. 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? 1, 2, 3. You can hold it in your hand and see for yourself. Yeah. Just hold it any length and look at the water. You have to, and you have, you see. Okay, I dissipated. Wait. Okay, go back. See? So with this, this is what I made for designers who have no idea about biogeometry. It's a tool with which you can detect when you have the right proportions or things like that. Now, you have a workshop with my daughters, and they will show you how to use this simple tool when you go out and you'll work with them. Okay, thank you. Sure. No, there was a question there. Okay. Laura, last question. I can't hear you. Louder, huh? I can't get what you're saying from there. Stand up and say it loud, yes.
The star.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the star, since we call it, it's the eruption of the pulse